of practicing church in almost an entirely virtual way. And if you're a member, a regular attender of our church, we certainly miss you, and we're looking forward to getting back together. And if you happen to attend another church, or you've just been logging on to these devotions, we're certainly glad to get some connection to you in our church. One of the problems that I have encountered over the last several weeks in conversations with people is how much withdrawal people are having in this idea of social distancing. And I got to thinking about it. I had a conversation with somebody this morning, and they actually said this. They said, "I think I'm going crazy if I have to stay in this house any longer." And I think it really gets to the heart of the issue of who we are and how God made us. And I thought I'd spend a few minutes in the book of Psalms today, in a particular Psalm, Psalm 31. You may want to find it, and talk to you about how we find a cure for loneliness, how we learn to deal with those lonely feelings that we have in our lives. David wrote this psalm. It was one of his psalms. It's messianic in nature. That is, it has a specific reference to the coming Messiah, the greater than David. And there's an exact quote, in fact, from Jesus on the cross when he says, "Into thine hand I commit my spirit." So David is giving us a glimpse into not just his own experiences of loneliness, but really into some of the feelings that Jesus would have had in those moments of feeling forsaken on the cross. You may have heard about the man who was so lonely that he went to a psychiatrist and asked the psychiatrist to give him a split personality. When the psychiatrist asked him why he would want that, he reasoned, at least I'd have somebody to talk to and somebody to live with. Well, I'm not sure that a split personality is the cure for your loneliness, but I do think the Bible has a way to help us deal with it. The problem of loneliness is not unique. People in every walk of life, from all social stratas and from every background, deal with the feelings of loneliness from the top to the bottom, from the rich to the poor, and from the famous to the infamous that live in life. We have a tendency to base our sense about the fullness of our lives on our circumstances. You could say it this way: we see that when life is good, it's filled with song, and when circumstances are adverse in the bad times of life, we're filled with sorrow. And David is living through that in Psalm 31. In fact, he says here in Psalm 31 in verse number 9, "Have mercy upon me, O Lord, for I am in trouble. Mine eye is consumed with grief, yea, my soul and my belly. My life is spent with grief, and my years with sighing. My strength faileth because of mine iniquity, and my bones are consumed. I was a reproach among all mine enemies, but especially among my neighbors, and a fear to mine acquaintance, that they did see me, or they that did see me without fled from me." So he was approached to his enemies, even to his neighbors, to his acquaintance, and when people saw him, they fled from him. "I'm forgotten as a dead man, out of mind, and I am like a broken vessel." Boy, those are some really haunting words, and some experiences that we really wouldn't wish upon anybody at all. It really kind of teaches us this about loneliness, that the sign of loneliness is that you are left feeling empty. Several times David mentions his grief. What he's really saying is, at a time in my life when I should be full, including full of relationships, I am sensing loss, abandonment, being on my own. C.S. Lewis reminds us that whole idea of needing people is really innate into human nature. Lewis wrote, "We're born helpless. And as soon as we're fully conscious, we discover loneliness. In fact, we need others physically, emotionally, intellectually. We need them if we are to know anything at all. Even ourselves, we need to know other people. We need to have those feelings filled in our relationships with other people." Do you know that the very first thing that God identifies as being a problem in the Bible. It's not good for man to be alone. Pre-fall, God says you're going to experience a great deal of loss in your life. So loneliness leaves you empty, but it also, this is a sign of being lonely, it leaves you exhausted. David talks about his strength failing and his life filled with sighing. So this once vibrant warrior, this great worshiper of God, this man who the Bible describes him, God's own words, that he was a man after God's own heart, is a tired and lonely figure. We see that in so many different people and lives, in so many different people's lives. I'm reminded of a little story about Abraham Lincoln. The night that Lincoln died, April the 14th, that's April the 14th, 1865, think about that. When he was assassinated, there was a small container that contained the handful of items that were in his pockets. Here's what was in his pockets: a handkerchief that was embroidered A. Lincoln, a country boy's penknife, a spectacle case repaired with a string, a purse with a $5 bill. By the way, it was a Confederate $5 bill, not a federal $5 bill, and some old and worn newspaper clippings. And the clippings contained an article that reported a speech in which a spokesman says Abraham Lincoln is one of the greatest men of all times. Now, today we think back about that and we think Lincoln surely is one of the great presidents of our time. But here was a guy at the peak of power and yet felt so alone, so stalked by this sense of loneliness and frustration and futility. He had to be reminded that he may not be the way that his feelings dictated that he was. So we know that there's a sign of loneliness. There's also a source of loneliness. And that source of loneliness, you see it really gets not just that physically being alone, but when he says, I'm forgotten, I'm as a dead man out of mind. Think about all the people in the Bible that went through great difficulties and trials. Job, for example, Joseph, Jeremiah, all had feelings of being forsaken and forgotten. That is so small and so insignificant, so forgotten by other people, that their feelings were communicating to them and convincing them, hey, really, you don't matter. I think it's realistic that in this time of social distancing and isolation, that we begin to think, hey, maybe we don't matter as much. We're not interacting with people. We're not having that kind of reinforcement that comes from others. Well, let me remind you, there is a solution for the loneliness that you're feeling. If you think about this statement, Psalm 31, verse 5, into thine hand I commit my spirit. There was a time on the cross, Jesus hung on the cross for 6 hours. There's a time in the last 3 hours where the whole earth turned dark. There was a time when Jesus cried out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Literally, my God, why have you forgotten me? Jesus felt alone. You know, when you look at that, you say, well, wonder how Jesus dealt with that, or what was at the root of that. There's a great verse in the book of Hebrews. It says this: Jesus himself said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. So Jesus on the cross said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then after the cross, he says, I'll never leave you or forsake you. This is Jesus' way of saying this. Of all the people who was significant, the ultimate person that ever lived, who should have never been forgotten, who should have never been alone, who should have never been rejected, experienced all the brokenness, all the forgetting, all the isolation, all the loneliness that you and I really deserve, so that we would not have to be lonely when we believe on him. God sent Jesus into the world so that when we believe on him, we enter into a relationship with him. We receive his gift of life, And in him, as we feed on him, that life is what convinces us that we're in fellowship with him, that we really do matter. We matter to God and we matter to others because we have this infinite value in our relationship with Jesus Christ. Can I remind you that as you go through this season, you may feel alone, but you're not alone. The promise that God makes to us is this: I will never leave you or forsake you. Let that encourage your heart as you live through this season of social distancing.